Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see a good-sized crowd here today, and we're going to talk about one of the non-controversial aspects of U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East. I mean, I say that with tongue-in-cheek. The Middle East, as many of you know, is in a state of disorder, and that's the title of the lecture today. So let me start with some introductory remarks, and then we're going to go to some of the issues. So the Middle East is facing one of its most unstable periods in its modern history, even though for those of you who know about Middle Eastern history, there have been, of course, many unstable periods, but now I think we're in one of the most unstable ones. There are many different conflicts that are going on. Some are sectarian, the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims, some geopolitical divisions, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, some ideological divisions, secular-oriented people versus religious-oriented people, and some related to the last point, such as internal struggles and civil wars that are currently taking place in Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and many, and all of these conflicts actually are spurred on by outside powers. Democracy in the Arab world has been stymied by the failure of the Arab Spring, which broke out in roughly 2011, with the exception of Tunisia. And authoritarianism has returned, or in many cases never went away. And the current situation in Egypt is one of the prime examples of that authoritarianism that has come about. And we'll get into some of these details in the course of the lecture. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this long simmering conflict that's been going on for many decades, is stuck in second gear. There was initial optimism, at least in some circles, when Trump came to power in 2017, but it has been stymied by basically two main factors. The Trump administration's policies on Jerusalem, that is recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and the Palestinians' outright rejection of that stance. For those of you who know the history of the U.S. peace process efforts, the Jerusalem issue was always the issue that was kicked down the road because it was so controversial. And Jerusalem is the holy site for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But with one fell swoop, that seemed to have been taken care of, at least from the Trump administration's perspective. But from the Palestinian perspective, this was a non-starter. And then you have internal problems, both within the Israeli polity and the Palestinian polity. Right now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has a lot of legal problems, and he may be indicted very soon. And the Palestinians also have a lot of problems. There's still a split between Hamas, the secular Palestinian nationalist movement, versus Hamas, which is the Islamist Palestinian national movement. And Fatah controls the West Bank for the most part. Hamas controls Gaza. And they've never been able to reconcile that split, even though on paper there's some efforts to do so. Right now, there's also a lot of confusion about the U.S. role in the region, whether or not to withdraw troops from Syria. For those of you who may have followed this in the press, President Trump's policy on this issue seemed to have bounced back and forth at least several times, whether U.S. troops should stay or leave. And now the latest is that he's going to keep about 200 to 400 troops in Syria. But this back and forth confused not only people in the region, but confused U.S. allies in Europe. So that's kind of emblematic. And Russia now under Putin is now exerting more and more influence in the Middle East. And we see that not only in Syria, but in other countries, which we'll get to. Okay, so one of the reasons why we think the Middle East is also in disorder is that the two main players who have vied for leadership in the region, Egypt and Iraq, are basically in disorder. themselves. So if you're in disorder, it's hard to then be the leader of the region. Traditionally, Egypt and Iraq have competed for influence over Syria. And for those of you who know maybe the history of the Cold War in the Middle East, that was always this area of contestation between Egypt and Iraq over Syria. But as I said, both Egypt and Iraq are still reeling from their domestic problems. The effects of the 2003 war in Iraq is still a big burden on the Iraqi polity. Of course, over the past few years, they've had this ongoing struggle with ISIS, which has led to the devastation of many Iraqi cities. Egypt is still beset with internal economic and political troubles stemming from the 2011 revolution and the 2013 coup by then Defense Minister Sisi. Saudi Arabia is now trying to step into this breach because Egypt and Iraq are no longer the main players in terms of regional leadership. And under the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia has actually taken a much more aggressive stance in the Middle East than they used to. Saudi Arabia, before the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, was actually quite conservative in terms of being a big player in the region. But now, under his leadership, the Saudi policy is now taking offensives in Yemen and taking a very strong role against Iran. But there's problems, of course, with that. Saudi leadership is in question because one, the war in Yemen, which the Saudis believe they could handle within a few months, has turned out to be a complete disaster. Many of you know that there's famine in Yemen, there's a tremendous humanitarian crisis, and the Saudis have not been able to dislodge the Shia group in Yemen called the Houthis that is backed up somewhat by Iran. So this aggressive posture by Mohammed bin Salman has not really led to any victory for the Saudis. And that, I think, has tainted their ability to, or inhibited their ability for regional leadership. And then many of you know this sort of brutal incident of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Washington Post writer and journalist, and he was brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. The Saudis have, made many comments about, what actually happened, and most of them are really not to be believed. There's a lot of holes in these arguments, and it seems that the Saudi leadership is doing its best to try to make sure Mohammed bin Salman is not tied to this murder, but there's, of course, a lot of questions about that. And in fact, the U.S. intelligence community has been reported in the press, has basically said the Khashoggi murder would not have taken place without the blessings of Mohammed bin Salman. Because of these two major problems, the war in Yemen and the Khashoggi murder, there has been a downturn in U.S.-Saudi relations, particularly in Congress. Now, the Trump administration wants to maintain very friendly ties to the Saudi leadership, but what we're seeing over the past few months is that Congress is becoming much more involved in scrutinizing the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and that has actually led to the downturn of bilateral relations. So one of the selling points for the Saudis is that they can sort of play the U.S. card for a regional advantage, but now with U.S.-Saudi relations on the skids, they can't even sell that card. So that's why this issue of the Saudis being the leaders right now in the Middle East is really not set in stone. So, and I talked about this just a minute ago, blocking arms sales and assistance. We could have even more activity in Congress. Even though the Saudis pay for the U.S. military items that they purchase, all military sales have to have the approval of Congress to go forward. So you could see within the next few months more efforts to block those type of sales. So the question is, then what about Iran? Can Iran become the leader of the Middle East? Well, I put this chart up here, basically looking at the pluses and the minuses for Iran. One, Iran is a large country. It's geographically and demographically large. It has substantial and relatively effective armed forces. They're not effective, say, vis-a-vis the United States, but they're certainly effective vis-a-vis other regional players in the Middle East. Iran does have influence over many of the Shia communities in the Arab world, and the Shia represent a minority within the Arab world, but it's still a substantial minority. And Iran can demonstrate that it can stand up to the United States. It doesn't have to kowtow to Washington. So, these are kind of the selling points that Iran has for regional leadership. But on the other hand, it has a lot of minuses. Iran, as many of you know, is dominated by Persians, and they're non-Arabs. And historically, there has been animosities between Persians and Arabs. So as a Persian-dominated country, Iran would have difficulty leading the rest of the Middle East, which are dominated by Arabs. And most Arabs also are Sunni Muslims. Even though Iran has ties to some Arab Shia Muslims, the fact that it has these ties to Shia Muslims then brings out anger from Sunni Muslims against Iran for extending its influence to these Shia communities. And in fact, Jordanian King Abdullah in late 2004 even made a comment that what we're seeing as a Shia crescent. And in other words, he's trying to say that if we don't watch out, Iran through Shia communities is going to extend its influence from Iran through Iraq, which has a slight majority of Shias in Iraq, into Syria. Syria is a country that is majority Sunni Muslim, but the leadership is an offshoot of Shia Islam. And then into Lebanon, which Hezbollah, which is a Shia group, is now playing a very prominent role. So this fear of Iran extending its influence has actually backfired to some extent, because then it alarms the Sunnis of the Muslim world to say we have to hold back against Iran's influence. And then on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iran really can only play a spoiler role. In other words, it can use its influence with some Palestinian groups to resist Israel, but that is not going to actually bring about what the Palestinians hope for, which is an independent Palestinian state. So the minuses for Iran for leadership in the region, in my mind, actually overweigh the pluses for Iran. Okay, I alluded to this earlier, but let's take a closer look at the war in Yemen. It's a combination of things: an internal conflict, a geopolitical conflict, and also a sectarian conflict. And this is why it's been so difficult to solve. So there's been long-standing problems that go back many, many years between the group in the northern part of Yemen called the Zaydi Shias, and they're represented today by what's called the Houthis. And they have this area in the north of Yemen, but they've been in a long-standing conflict with the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and Sunni Muslims who control that area. But in late 2014, early 2015, in the midst of chaos in Yemen, the Houthis moved south with their troops and took over the city of Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and then tried to press on to the city of Aden, which is in the southern part of Yemen, a major port city. In March of 2015, the Saudis then stepped in and got a coalition of Arab Sunni countries to oppose the Houthis by playing up the Iranian threat. Now, Iran has given the Houthis some military assistance, but in my mind, the Saudis have actually hyped up this threat, and probably what the Saudis claim as massive amounts of Iranian assistance is probably over-exaggerated, because Yemen was flush with weapons even before this period, and the Houthis were just able to, take over military stores of ammunition and weapons when they moved south. So even though one can say the Houthis are somewhat tied to Iran, they're actually operating mostly on their own. But nonetheless, the Saudis try to play this conflict as a sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia and between the Arab Sunni states and Iran. But the war has actually become deadlocked because the Houthis were not able to advance further south. They got to the areas around Aden in the south, but never took the city of Aden and the port. And then the Saudi bombing campaign has been largely ineffective. The Saudi bombing campaign has actually killed more civilians than Houthi militants. And that's been a big public relations disaster for the Saudis, because their bombing campaign has helped to create a kind of humanitarian disaster. And Iran, very cleverly, sees Yemen as a relatively inexpensive way to keep the Saudis busy in their backyard. For those of you who know the geography of the Persian Gulf, there's Iran to the north, the Gulf, and then Saudi Arabia to the south. So as long as the Saudis are busy in their southwest, which is by the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, they're not going to be able to do anything in the Persian Gulf against Iran. So this is a relatively inexpensive way for Iran, with not that much assistance, to keep the Saudis busy in their southwestern corner. And also the coalition the Saudis have assembled, once it was a large coalition, but I think a lot of other Arab Sunni countries tried to join the coalition just to get in the good graces of the Saudis to get money. But right now it's basically Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that small country, but it's an oil-rich country in the Gulf. They have now, it appears to have different agendas in Yemen. The UAE, or United Arab Emirates, actually, well, some people claim, and there's probably some evidence to it, that they actually want a separate southern Yemen. Yemen was a divided country until 1991, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, may want to have a separate southern Yemen so it can control the ports of that country along the Arabian Sea. Whereas the Saudis want to maintain some type of influence in the northern part of Yemen. And even though they're both opposed to the Houthis, it's not clear, what is their end game in this struggle. The war has, as I alluded to earlier, led to this huge humanitarian disaster. Many of you have read about this in the press. There's cholera epidemic, and there's a famine. At least 8 million Yemenis are let's put it this way. Many of them have already died of starvation, and the famine can actually affect even millions of people. People are very close to famine. What I've heard from NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have tried to get aid into Yemen, is that there is actually food in Yemen that's been imported, but the food prices are so high that ordinary Yemens can't even afford to purchase that food. And this compounds the problem. Now, over the past couple of months, the UN has tried to intervene in this crisis. They've set up kind of a temporary truce so that more humanitarian supplies could go to a port in the northern part of Yemen, which was controlled by the Houthis, and there's supposed to be a cessation of hostilities. But there's been, violations of this kind of ceasefire, and even though there's efforts by the UN to try to get a peace plan on the table, that has not really worked very well. So this has been a real problem, not only from a humanitarian point of view, but from a political point of view. And the Saudis, whether they like it or not, are tied to this war. And as I said, their reputation has actually been tarnished by this conflict. Now let's look at other conflicts in the region. And I'm sorry, this is not very a happy lecture because I'm talking about a lot of different problems. But let's look at the Syrian civil war. This war has been going on since 2011. It initially started by peaceful protests by people opposed to the Bashar Assad regime, but then it quickly became a violent conflict as his security forces cracked down on the protesters. And then the population basically split between pro and anti-Assad forces, as well as the military establishment that was split. Opposition to the Assad regime over time became increasingly Islamist. And by that I mean that there were some elements of the Syrian society who were secular oriented, and they opposed the Bashar Assad regime. But over time, more and more outside influence came in, and the opposition took on more of an Islamist, people supporting political Islam. That type of orientation. And the conflict then was portrayed by the opposition as a conflict between Islam on the one hand, and then what they would call the heretical Alawites on the other. As I mentioned earlier, the Alawites are a minority within Syria that's an offshoot of Shia Islam. And for many Sunnis who have a very fundamentalist streak to them, they believe that the Alawites are not really true Muslims and they are heretics. So this is why this conflict has become so bloody and so much of an existential struggle. Because if your opponent sees you as a heretic, then you're going to fight to the death, because you would feel that if they capture you, you're going to die anyway. And the regime, both the regime and the opposition have used very brutal tactics against each other in this conflict. Now, when the conflict started to turn against, in other words, the tide of the civil war started to turn against the Bashar Assad regime, Iran and Russia intervened on the side of the regime. Iran intervened because they've had long-standing ties to the Assad regime, not only because of this Shia connection, but because Iran sees the Assad regime as their kind of way station for influence next door into Lebanon. Many of the supplies that Iran gives to Hezbollah in Lebanon actually go through Syria. So Iran keenly did not want to stop that spigot of arms flow to their ally in Lebanon. But from Russia's perspective under Putin, this was his way to reestablish Russia's role in the Middle East. And during the Soviet period and during the Cold War, Syria did get a lot of assistance from Moscow. And now, even with the end of the Cold War, Putin is trying to reestablish and even enhance those type of ties. there was a long-standing Soviet naval base in Syria on the Mediterranean coast, which remained then under Russia. And then during the Civil War, the Russians also established an air base not too far from that naval base. And Russia has participated in many, many airstrikes against the opposition. They say, they're only firing against the terrorists, but they use the word terrorist to include everybody that's in opposition to Assad. So both the more moderate elements of the opposition as well as the more extreme Islamist groups have been targeted not only by the Assad regime but also by Russia and Iran. Now, what about U.S. policy? Well, I say it's confused. As many of you know, President Obama, because he was an opponent of the Iraq War in 2003 and saw that as a disaster, did not want to get involved militarily next door in Syria. So Obama was very reluctant to get involved. There were some clandestine CIA support for some moderate rebels, and the reason we know that is that was on the front pages of the Washington Post for quite some time. But it was a very, very small effort. There wasn't any big effort by the U.S. to support the opposition. And Obama, as I said, was just personally reluctant to get involved. And many of you know that he undertook this saying, there's a red line, we will get involved if Syria used chemical weapons. Well, they did use chemical weapons, and there was discussions in the Obama administration whether they should actually attack Syria. But then the Russians came up with an idea that if Assad gives up all of its chemical weapons, then the United States should not strike. And Obama seized on that as a way not to strike Syria. Now, of course, he was criticized by Republicans for not doing so, and President Trump, when he was a candidate, Trump criticized Obama. But when you look at it, the Trump policy towards Syria and the Obama policy towards Syria really wasn't that fundamentally different. It's the only thing that Trump did was that when Assad did use chemical weapons, he did strike Syria in April 2017 and April 2018, but there wasn't any massive effort to overturn the Assad government. Both Obama and Trump then concentrated on the fight against ISIS, which had taken over the eastern parts of Syria, particularly the northeastern quadrant of Syria to a large degree. So the policy that Obama started, in other words, there would be some U.S. troops, not a lot, in eastern Syria, backed by U.S. air power and coalition air power, and then support for the Syrian Kurds to fight against ISIS. That policy was actually adopted also by Trump, even though I think Trump doesn't want to admit that because he's always trying to portray himself as the anti-Obama. But essentially, the U.S.-Syria policy has been the same. And right now, ISIS is basically on its last leg. I mean, there's only kind of one or two villages left under its control, and that village could fall any time now. But then the question is, what does the U.S. do? As I said in the introductory remarks, well, let's put it this way. There is a problem in terms of U.S. credibility because President Trump has actually changed his policy on the number of U.S. troops and whether U.S. troops should all leave or stay several times. And this has led to a lot of confusion in the region. And in December of 2018, just a few months ago, he then just decided one day we're going to leave altogether. This caused a lot of consternation because the Pentagon wasn't even consulted by his decision. Normally you have a meeting of the top brass and your national security team before you make such a precipitous decision. But he just decided this on his own. And this led to a lot of concern that, one, ISIS was not completely defeated. So if the US pulls out precipitously, ISIS could stage a rebound. Two, there's a question of the Kurds in Syria, because the Kurds have been allies of the United States in the fight against ISIS. But Turkey, the big northern neighbor to the north, sees these Kurds as terrorists. And so Turkey has threatened actually to invade the northeastern part of Syria to wipe out these Kurds. So the fear was among US military planners is that if the US leaves altogether, there'll be nothing to prevent Turkey then to come into northeastern Syria and to wipe out the Syrian Kurds who have been US allies. So there was just a lot of concern, and even Trump's Republican allies in Congress were critical of a total US withdrawal. And then just a few weeks ago, then Trump announces that, we're going to keep 200 to 400 troops in Syria. Now, this may work to at least prevent the Turks from invading northern Syria and perhaps prevent ISIS from returning, but it's not going to change the dynamic within Syria itself, because Assad has basically won the civil war, and whatever the US says that he should go, who's going to take him out? I mean, most likely he's going to remain in power. So Libya. Libya, after Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011 and killed, has been beset by violence. There's this huge outgrowth of militias in Libya. Some of them were ideologically driven, others were just kind of neighborhood extortion gangs, but people have a lot of weapons. And then out of this chaos, you have two rival governments in Libya, one in the west, one in the east. The one in the east is supported by more secular-oriented Libyans, and it's backed by a military strongman, a former Gaddafi officer, but he broke from Gaddafi many years ago, General Khalifa Haftar. And he's now ensconced in the east, and he's supported by Egypt, he's supported by the United Arab Emirates, and also Russia. And then you have another government in the West, which has support from the United Nations, but it's also being supported by the Libyan equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you still have this very divided situation in Libya and ongoing violence there. There's attempts by the UN and the EU, the European Union, to bring about reconciliation, but those efforts have really not succeeded. And then let's talk about Egypt. There was a lot of hope in 2011 with the Egypt popular uprising against then President Hosni Mubarak, that Egypt would somehow manage to transition to a democracy, but those hopes have been shattered. Egypt has been plagued by weak institutions historically. When you sort of dissect Egyptian society, there were only two strong forces in the country. One was the military, and the other was the Muslim Brotherhood. Other institutions were weak, and the liberal forces that were supposed to sort of come to the surface in the wake of 2011 were weak and disorganized. Many brave young people, many of them had university degrees, came from middle-class backgrounds. You saw the images on CNN. They took to the streets, particularly the central square in Cairo, called Tahrir Square. They were very good at staging demonstrations, but they were very bad, I would say, at organizing a new and strong political forces that could compete electorally. So when Egypt, after the 2011 revolution, had its elections, the major winners were the Muslim Brotherhood and even more fundamentalist parties to the right of the Brotherhood, whereas the liberal secular forces only garnered something like 20% of the vote. So that was a problem for Egyptian democracy. And when the Muslim Brotherhood leader at the time, Mohamed Morsi, won the presidency in 2012, his presidency turned out to be a disaster. At times he even acted as an authoritarian figure. He even declared at one point that my presidential decrees would no longer be subjected to judicial review. And he sounded like an authoritarian figure. And this and his policies, even though he wasn't really able to carry them out, but at least his hoped-for policies scared a lot of secular-oriented Egyptians who feared the imposition of a religious state, and it also upset the military establishment. I spent a lot of time in Egypt, and in many respects, the Egyptians are like Americans. You know, they're religious, but they don't want the government or another organization telling them how religious they should be. It's up to the individual, it's up to the family, and many secular-oriented Egyptians believed that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to impose like an Iran-style theocracy on the country, and so they were very upset about that. There were mass demonstrations in June of 2013, and then the military stepped in. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was the defense minister, then basically stages a military coup and removes Morsi from power with the support of many secular-oriented Egyptians. He also employed a lot of violence in August of 2013 against the Brotherhood and their supporters, but his very harsh policies not only went after the Brotherhood. Since that time, he's gone after secular dissidents, journalists and bloggers, many of them middle-class, secular-oriented people, but he has thin skin. He doesn't like any criticism of his policies, and if you're a journalist and you write a critical article, there's a very good chance you're going to be thrown in prison. So that's part of the renewed authoritarianism that we see in the Middle East, but particularly in Egypt. But now, and his supporters, Sisi supporters, are now very dominant in the Egyptian parliament, and now there's a movement afoot in parliament to eliminate term limits. Under the new constitution, a president was only going to serve 2 terms in office, like our system, and that was seen as a democratic policy that would prevent an entrenched presidency. But now there's movement in parliament to eliminate term limits so Sisi can remain in power until 2034, which is another 15 years from now. And that's basically what Mubarak, in other words, Mubarak's long reign. Sisi is replicating that. And some people believe he's even more repressive than Mubarak ever was. So there's a lot of disheartening sort of developments in Egypt at this point. Now we'll look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Trump announces that he's going to unleash the deal of the century when he came to power to get the Israeli-Palestinian peace process finally solved. But as I said earlier, his decision on Jerusalem was a disaster for the peace process because the U.S. was no longer seen as an honest broker. And Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and his right-wing cabinet were really never interested in territorial compromise. And the only way you're going to get a solution to the conflict is territorial compromise. But then Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, has been in a weak position himself. As I said earlier, once the Jerusalem decision was made, he no longer participated in any peace talks, and he is also in a weak position. The Trump peace plan has not been divulged publicly, but his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's the main sort of driver of this, has apparently, just in the past few weeks, taken a trip to various parts of the Arab world to sell this peace plan. But from what I gather, there's really been no takers, because it seems like the Trump peace plan is heavily skewed towards Israel. And even though the Saudis and other Arab states want to maintain good ties to Trump, they don't believe this peace plan can actually solve the problem. They're supposed to release this peace plan at some point, but they haven't done so yet. So there's been no support among the Arabs, even the Saudis, with whom the Trump people have tried to cultivate. And there's been low-level violence over the past couple of years. There's been violence on the border between Gaza and Israel, as well as some violence in Jerusalem. So that has really dampened the atmosphere for peace. And as I said before, Prime Minister Netanyahu is now in legal jeopardy at home. Some people in his former coalition have left, and now he's gone to embrace some people on the far right of Israel, which even Yitzhak Shamir, when he was in power as prime minister, never really did. But the problem is, for the peace process, is that the pro-peace elements within the Israeli society are still in the minority. The heyday of optimism with the Oslo Accords in the 1990s has gone down, and now the right wing is still in power in Israel. And on the Palestinian side, there's really no change in leadership. I think they do require new leaders at this point. But Abbas is apparently not going to leave office anytime soon, and there probably won't be a new leader among the Palestinians until he dies in office. So finally, let's look at the US and Russia in the region. The US is still the dominant naval power in the Persian Gulf, and this is largely to do with, one, keeping the oil flowing from the Gulf. Even though the US is not as dependent on Gulf oil as it once was, Europe, Japan, and other countries are still dependent on that. And if there's ever a disruption of Gulf oil, the price in this country of oil is going to go up because it's a world market. So that's one of the big reasons to keep a big naval presence in the Gulf. But one, also to reassure the Saudis that the US is still an ally of theirs, but also it's tied in now with keeping Iran boxed in. Many of you know that Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal that was done in 2015, and part of that strategy is to keep Iran boxed in and to apply more sanctions against Iran. So in terms of the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the US hasn't really retreated. But US influence in the region as a whole, I would argue, has been in decline. We're largely absent from Libya. The Europeans are taking the lead there. We now have less influence over Egypt. US aid to Egypt has actually gone down, and the Trump embrace of Sisi, the president of Egypt, has, I think, hurt the US image among people who advocate for less repression and more democracy in Egypt. Except for the anti-ISIS fight, the US has really no influence over Syria in terms of the Assad government, and it has very problematic influence in Iraq. And again, I don't want to bash Trump all the time, but he has made very controversial statements on Iraq. The day after he was sworn in office, he gives a public speech at the CIA headquarters where he says, well, we should have taken Iraqi oil the first time, and maybe next time we will. in the ears of people in the Middle East, this harks back to the colonial era, in the age of imperialism, and people were just kind of shocked, and this became very problematic, of course, within Iraq itself. And then just recently, he gives an interview on American television where he says, well, I visited this military base in Iraq. We spent a lot of money there, so we might as well keep it. Again, these type of comments do not do U.S. policy any good because it harks back to, I said, the age of imperialism, which we should not be associating ourselves with. And then the Iraqis are very sensitive to the issue of Iran because Iran has influence in Iraq. Some Iraqis want the U.S. to also be in Iraq as a balancer to Iran. But when Trump makes comments about Iran within the context of Iraq, many Iraqis, especially Iraqi Shia, then have to distance themselves from the United States. And finally, the U.S. support for the Saudi military role in Yemen has actually hurt the U.S. image in the region, at least among its peoples. There's been a lot of criticism among intellectuals in the Arab world, not only about Saudi Arabia's policies, but the U.S. being an enabler of the Yemen war. So, with no real push for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a fair way, people are also questioning the usefulness of the United States. In other words, the United States was seen, at least among many Arabs, as the country with influence over Israel to deliver a compromise to finally get an Israeli-Palestinian peace. But with Trump's holy embrace of the Netanyahu government and the Palestinians pulling out of the peace process, then what is the U.S. role in the peace process? In other words, we've lost our leverage as an honest broker, and that's hurt the United States. Russia's role in support of Syria and Iran is controversial. There are many Arab Sunni states who do not like that role, but Russia has demonstrated, at least with Syria, and is now building bridges to Egypt and Libya, that they can play, like they did in the Cold War, a role to come to the aid of friendly states. But Russia has also cleverly even developed ties to the Saudis, because both Russia and the Saudis are oil producers. So you do have meetings between the Russians and the Saudis on oil matters. And so Russia is using that as a way to get back in the region. And even the Netanyahu government is having friendly relations with Russia. Netanyahu himself has met with Putin many times over the past several years. So, and part of it has to do with the Israelis wanting the Russians to hold back Iran and Syria, but nonetheless, you do have Israel now developing close ties to Russia. So what's in the crystal ball? This is how I'm going to end this. Unfortunately, I can't be very optimistic. I think instability is going to be with us for quite some time. There's no apparent solutions to many of these conflicts that I outlined today. As I said, there's a temporary ceasefire in Yemen, but there's a lot of violations to that ceasefire, and there's no real peace effort among the warring parties. Saudi Arabia and Iran are likely to remain enemies not only over Yemen, but over other conflicts. And the Saudis see any legitimate grievances by Arab Shia. Many of the Arab Shia are considered second-class citizens in some Arab Sunni countries, but they'll see any disturbances of protests or whatever as Iran-inspired. In other words, they would see Iran having a hand in any of these activities, which then affects the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. ISIS, as we know from the press, as I said earlier, has lost almost all of its territory in Syria and Iraq, and that's a good thing because it was a terrible and brutal regime that they established. But the grievances that gave way to ISIS among many Sunnis in both countries have not gone away. As I said earlier, much of the Sunni cities of Iraq have been heavily, heavily damaged. There's estimates that it would cost over $100 billion, maybe $130 billion to repair a lot of these cities. The international community has only pledged about $30 billion, and many of those checks haven't even arrived. So, you could have a situation where the rebuilding of those damaged parts of Sunni Iraq, the Sunni portions of Iraq, don't get done. And then many Iraqi Sunnis, and next door the Sunnis of eastern Syria, feel that perhaps they have to rise again. That led to the ability of ISIS to at least get some adherence from these populations. So even though ISIS is now almost totally defeated in this region, at least in Syria and Iraq, they have affiliates elsewhere, another ISIS-like group could emerge. And if all this was not bad enough, there's a danger of war with Iran. And I don't want to be a doomsday guy, but I just wanted to give us food for thought here. The Trump administration says it doesn't want regime change in Iran. Well, it doesn't pursue regime change in Iran. But when you look at their policies, that's, I think, what they're after. And some of his top advisors, like John Bolton, who was National Security Advisor before he entered the Trump administration, has had a long record in favoring regime change in Iran. So Bolton himself may be wanting to use his position to influence Trump and to go to war against Iran. And if Trump does get impeached, or there are various legal charges that have real sort of salience to them in the coming months, there's always that danger of what's called the wag the dog, of a U.S. war to divert public attention from his domestic troubles. So I'm not saying this is very likely, but I'm saying it's a possibility. So on that uplifting note, I will end my talk. And sorry it was gloom and doom, but I just wanted to lay out a lot of the problems that I see in the Middle East. But I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.